Welcome back to the Ghastly Journal, where we uncover the most disturbing tales hidden in the forgotten corners of human history. I'm your host, and today we're diving into one of the most chilling stories of collective terror I've ever encountered. This is the story of Greywater, a village that lived in absolute fear of something as simple as their own reflection. Before we begin, I need to warn you. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about superstition, about the power of collective belief, and about the thin line between sanity and madness. The events I'm about to describe took place over the course of 18 months, and by the end, an entire community had been transformed into something unrecognizable. So dim your lights, settle in, and prepare yourself for a journey into one of history's most unsettling mysteries. This is the story of when a whole village feared mirrors. The remote village of Greywater sits nestled in the moors of northern England, a place where mist clings to the ground like ghostly fingers and ancient stone cottages huddle together against the perpetual dampness. In 1847, it was home to just over 300 souls, mostly farmers and tradespeople who had lived there for generations. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where traditions ran as deep as the roots of the gnarled oak trees that dotted the landscape. But by the winter of 1848, Greywater had become something else entirely. A place where every mirror had been shattered, where reflective surfaces of any kind were covered or destroyed, and where the very mention of seeing one's own image could send grown men into fits of terror. The transformation began with a single family. The Ashfords had been pillars of the Greywater community for over a century. Thomas Ashford ran the village's only inn, while his wife Margaret tended to their 3 children and helped with the establishment. They were respected, well-liked, and considered among the most rational people in the village, which is why what happened to them was so particularly disturbing. It started on a cold October morning in 1847. Margaret Ashford was preparing breakfast in the kitchen of their inn when she caught sight of her reflection in the polished surface of a copper pot. According to her later testimony, what she saw wasn't herself but something else entirely. Something that wore her face but had eyes that belonged to someone or something else. Margaret's screams brought her husband running. He found her cowering in the corner of the kitchen, pointing at the copper pot with a trembling finger. When Thomas looked at the pot himself, he saw only his wife's distorted reflection, nothing more. But Margaret insisted that the thing in the reflection had smiled at her, a cold, knowing smile that no human face should ever wear. Thomas, being a practical man, attributed his wife's episode to exhaustion. Margaret had been working long hours helping with the inn while caring for their youngest child, who had been ill with a fever. Stress, he reasoned, could make anyone see things that weren't there. He gently convinced Margaret to return to her duties, and for the rest of the day, life at the Ashford Inn continued as normal. But that night, everything changed. The Ashfords' bedroom contained a large mirror, an expensive piece that had been in Thomas's family for generations. Margaret had always taken pride in that mirror, often commenting on its clarity and the beautiful way it caught the morning light. But that night, as she prepared for bed, she refused to look at it. She asked Thomas to turn it toward the wall, claiming that she couldn't bear to see her reflection, Thomas growing more concerned about his wife's mental state. tried to reason with her. He stood in front of the mirror, showing her that it reflected nothing but the truth. But when Margaret finally looked, she let out a scream that woke their children and several guests staying at the inn. What Margaret claimed to see in that mirror would haunt the village of Greywater for the next 18 months. She said that her reflection was moving independently, that it was performing actions she wasn't performing, making gestures she wasn't making. More terrifying still, she insisted that the reflection was aware of her watching it, that it would turn and look directly at her with eyes that held an intelligence that was distinctly not her own. Thomas saw none of this. To him, the mirror showed only what mirrors should show. But Margaret's terror was so genuine, so visceral, that he began to doubt his own perception. That night, he covered the mirror with a sheet, hoping to give his wife peace of mind. The next morning brought no relief. Margaret found her reflection in the window glass, in the surface of her tea, in every polished surface in the inn. Each time, she claimed, the reflection acted independently, sometimes mimicking her movements with a delay, sometimes performing entirely different actions. By midday, she was refusing to leave her room, terrified of encountering any surface that might show her image. Word of Margaret's condition spread quickly through Greywater. In a village where everyone knew everyone's business, such a dramatic change in behavior couldn't go unnoticed. The local physician, Dr. Edmund Hartwell, was summoned to examine her. Dr. Hartwell was a man of science, educated at Cambridge and skeptical of superstition. He diagnosed Margaret with a form of nervous exhaustion and prescribed rest and laudanum. But Margaret's condition didn't improve. If anything, it worsened. She began to speak of her reflection as if it were a separate entity, referring to it as she, and claiming that this other self was trying to communicate with her. According to Margaret, the reflection would mouth words that she couldn't hear, would make gestures that seemed to be warnings or threats. Thomas, desperate to help his wife, began to see things differently. He started paying closer attention to mirrors and reflective surfaces, looking for any sign of what Margaret claimed to see. And then 3 weeks after his wife's first episode, he saw it too. Thomas was shaving in front of their bedroom mirror when he noticed something odd. His reflection seemed to be holding the razor at a slightly different angle than he was. At first, he attributed it to a trick of the light, but as he continued to watch, the discrepancy became more pronounced. His reflection's movements began to lag behind his own and then, most terrifyingly, began to move independently. The rational part of Thomas's mind rejected what he was seeing. He closed his eyes, counted to 10, and looked again. But the phenomenon persisted. His reflection was no longer mimicking his movements. It was acting on its own, turning its head to look directly at him with an expression of cold intelligence. That night, Thomas covered every mirror in the inn. He told the guests that there had been an accident, that the mirrors had been damaged and were being repaired. But word was already spreading through Greywater. The Ashfords' strange behavior was becoming the subject of gossip and speculation. The third person to be affected was their eldest child, 12-year-old Sarah. She had been watching her parents' increasingly erratic behavior with growing concern. One evening, while helping her mother in the kitchen, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in the blade of a knife. What she saw made her drop the knife, the blade clattering to the floor as she backed away in horror. Sarah's reflection, she claimed, was older, not by much, but noticeably so. The reflection showed a version of herself that looked perhaps 15 or 16, with eyes that held knowledge that her 12-year-old self couldn't possibly possess. Most disturbing of all, the older reflection seemed to be trying to warn her about something, gesturing urgently toward the windows and doors of the inn. By November of 1847, the Ashford family had become complete recluses. They had covered or removed every reflective surface in their inn, and they rarely ventured outside during daylight hours when windows might show their reflections. The inn, once a bustling center of village life, had become a dark, shrouded place where guests were no longer welcome. The villagers of Greywater watched this transformation with growing unease. Some attributed the family's behavior to madness, others to some kind of curse. But as the weeks passed, more and more people began to report their own unsettling experiences with mirrors and reflective surfaces. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, the village seamstress, claimed that while working late one evening, she had seen her reflection continue sewing even after she had put down her needle. The reflection had looked up at her and smiled, a smile that Mrs. Whitmore described as knowing something terrible that I didn't know. The blacksmith, James Morton, reported that his reflection in the polished surface of a horseshoe had shown him working with tools he didn't recognize, crafting something that looked more like a weapon than anything useful for farming or trade. One by one, the people of Greywater began to experience what the Ashfords had experienced, and one by one they began to cover their mirrors to avoid reflective surfaces, to live in fear of their own image. But this was only the beginning. What started as isolated incidents was about to become something far more sinister, something that would challenge the very foundations of reality in this small English village. Dr. Hartwell found himself in an increasingly difficult position as more villagers came to him with complaints about their reflections. As a man of science and medicine, he was expected to provide rational explanations for what was clearly becoming a mass hysteria. But the consistency of the reports troubled him. Each person described the same basic phenomenon: reflections that acted independently, that seemed aware of being observed, that appeared to possess knowledge or intent beyond that of the person they were supposed to be mirroring. The doctor's skepticism began to waver when he encountered the case of young Timothy Fletcher, the 8-year-old son of the village carpenter. Timothy had been playing near a stream when he saw his reflection in the water. According to the boy's terrified account, his reflection had waved at him first before Timothy had raised his own hand. More disturbing still, the reflection had pointed toward the woods with an urgent gesture, as if trying to warn him of some unseen danger. When Dr. Hartwell examined Timothy, he found the child to be in perfect physical health. There were no signs of fever, no indication of illness that might cause hallucinations. The boy's account was lucid and detailed, delivered with the kind of straightforward honesty that children possess. It was becoming harder for the doctor to dismiss these incidents as simple hysteria. The breaking point came when Dr. Hartwell experienced the phenomenon himself. He was examining his medical instruments in his study, polishing the lens of his magnifying glass when he noticed something peculiar. His reflection in the curved surface of the lens was not holding the glass at the same angle he was. As he adjusted his grip, the reflection remained stationary for a moment before slowly, deliberately adjusting to match his position. The rational part of his mind searched for explanations. Perhaps it was an optical illusion caused by the curvature of the lens. Perhaps fatigue was affecting his perception. But as he continued to watch, the phenomenon became undeniable. His reflection was acting with a slight delay, as if it were making conscious decisions about how to respond to his movements. That night, Dr. Hartwell wrote in his journal, "I fear I am losing my grip on scientific reasoning. What I witnessed today challenges everything I understand about the nature of reflection and light. Yet I cannot dismiss what I saw with my own eyes. If this is madness, it is a madness that has infected half the village." By December of 1847, the transformation of Greywater was becoming impossible to ignore. The village had taken on an eerie quality as more and more households covered their mirrors and avoided reflective surfaces. Windows were kept shuttered during the day, polished metal objects were put away, and even the surface of the village well was covered with a wooden board to prevent anyone from seeing their reflection in the water. The local church, St. Mary's, became a focal point for the community's growing anxiety. Reverend William Blackwood found his congregation swelling as people sought comfort and explanation for what they were experiencing. But the Reverend himself was not immune to the phenomenon. During one Sunday's service, he caught sight of his reflection in the polished silver of the communion chalice and was horrified to see that his reflected image was delivering a different sermon entirely, one that he couldn't hear but could see from the movement of his reflection's lips. The Reverend's crisis of faith was profound. How could he minister to his flock when he couldn't trust his own reflection? He began to conduct services with all reflective objects covered, including the stained glass windows that had once been the pride of the church. The building took on a shrouded, tomb-like quality that only added to the village's growing sense of dread. It was around this time that the first death occurred. Mrs. Agnes Thornbury, an elderly widow who lived alone at the edge of the village, was found dead in her cottage by her neighbor. The circumstances were puzzling. Mrs. Thornbury appeared to have died of fright, her face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. But what made the scene particularly disturbing was the state of her cottage. Every mirror in the house had been smashed, but not from the outside. The glass fragments and the pattern of damage suggested that the mirrors had been struck from within, as if something had tried to break through from the other side. Mrs. Thornbury's body was found in her bedroom directly in front of where her dressing table mirror had once stood. Her hands were cut and bleeding, suggesting she had been the one to break the glass. The village constable, a practical man named Robert Hayes, investigated the scene with growing unease. He found Mrs. Thornbury's journal, and the final entries painted a picture of escalating terror. She had written about her reflection becoming increasingly aggressive, making threatening gestures and appearing to mouth words that she described as promises of terrible things to come. Her final entry, dated the night before her death, read, "She is trying to come through. I can see her pushing against the glass from the other side. The mirror bends and warps when she presses against it. I must stop her. I must break every mirror before she finds a way through." The death of Mrs. Thornbury sent shockwaves through the already terrified community. If the phenomenon could drive someone to their death, what did that mean for the rest of them? The village council convened an emergency meeting, but even this gathering was affected by the growing paranoia. The meeting had to be held in the church with all reflective surfaces covered, and several council members refused to attend, afraid of catching sight of their reflections in the windows of the building. During this meeting, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. As the villagers shared their experiences, it became clear that the reflections were not random or chaotic. They seemed to be showing people specific things: warnings, threats, or scenes from what might be the future. Sarah Ashford's reflection had appeared older, as if showing her a version of herself from years ahead. The blacksmith's reflection had been crafting unknown weapons. Mrs. Thornbury's reflection had been trying to break through from the other side. The question that haunted everyone was whether these reflections were showing them glimpses of things that would happen, or things that were happening somewhere else, in some other version of their world. Were they looking at alternate versions of themselves, or were they seeing into some other realm entirely? The village's isolation worked against them as word of their plight failed to reach the outside world. The winter of 1847 was particularly harsh, and the roads leading to and from Greywater became impassable. They were cut off from the outside world, left to deal with their growing terror alone. As the phenomenon continued to spread, affecting more and more villagers, the community began to fracture. Some, led by Dr. Hartwell, maintained that there must be a rational explanation, that mass hysteria was causing people to see things that weren't there. Others, influenced by Reverend Blackwood's increasingly apocalyptic sermons, believed they were witnessing some kind of supernatural invasion. A third group, the most terrifying of all, began to suggest that perhaps the reflections were real, that they were seeing into another world where different versions of themselves existed. These people spoke of their reflections as if they were entirely separate beings with their own motivations and desires. They claimed that the barriers between worlds were breaking down, that soon there would be no distinction between the real world and the world of reflections. This theory gained terrifying credibility when young Benjamin Carter made a discovery that would change everything. Benjamin was the village baker's apprentice, a quiet boy of 14 who had always been fascinated by the mechanics of everyday objects. While helping his master prepare bread early one morning, Benjamin noticed something that made his blood run cold. The bakery's large mixing bowl, polished to a mirror-like shine, was reflecting not just the present moment, but what appeared to be a scene from hours earlier. In the reflection, Benjamin could see himself and his master working, but they were preparing different bread, using different techniques, and most disturbing of all, they were speaking to someone who wasn't there in the real world. Benjamin watched in fascination and horror as his reflection turned to address an invisible figure, gesturing animatedly in what appeared to be a heated argument. The reflection's mouth moved with urgency, as if trying to warn or convince this unseen person of something critically important. But when Benjamin looked around the actual bakery, he and his master were completely alone. The boy's master, Thomas Hartley, initially dismissed Benjamin's claims as the product of an overactive imagination. But when Benjamin insisted that Hartley look for himself, the baker reluctantly peered into the polished surface of the bowl. What he saw there made him stumble backward, knocking over a sack of flour in his haste to get away. Hartley's reflection was not making bread at all. Instead, it was frantically boarding up windows, as if preparing for some kind of siege. The reflected version of himself looked older, more haggard, with the desperate expression of a man who had seen too much. Most terrifying of all, the reflection seemed to be aware of being watched. It turned toward the real Hartley and began gesturing frantically, pointing toward the bakery's windows and doors as if trying to warn him of approaching danger. Word of this incident spread through the village like wildfire. If the reflections were showing scenes from different times, or from different versions of their world, what did that mean for the nature of reality itself? The village's scholarly residents, led by the schoolmaster Edmund Fairfax, began to theorize that they were witnessing tears in the fabric of existence, glimpses into parallel worlds where different versions of their lives were playing out. But these weren't just random glimpses. The reflections seemed to be showing specific moments of crisis, warnings of dangers that hadn't yet come to pass in their world. This realization led to a chilling question. If the reflections were trying to warn them, what exactly were they being warned about? The answer came sooner than anyone expected. In mid-January of 1848, a traveling merchant named William Ashworth arrived in Greywater, having somehow managed to navigate the treacherous winter roads. Ashworth was a stranger to the village's affliction, and his presence brought a temporary sense of normalcy to the community. Here was someone from the outside world, someone who hadn't been affected by whatever was happening to their reflections. But Ashworth's visit would prove to be the catalyst for the most terrifying phase of the crisis. The merchant had brought with him a collection of fine mirrors intended for sale to the wealthier households in the region. When he attempted to display his wares in the village square, the reaction was immediate and violent. The villagers recoiled in terror at the sight of the uncovered mirrors, but something else happened that no one had anticipated. The mirrors began to show not the reflections of the people gathered around them, but scenes of absolute chaos. In one mirror, the village appeared to be burning, with figures running through streets filled with smoke and flame. In another, the same villagers who were standing peacefully in the square were shown engaged in violent conflict with shadowy figures that seemed to emerge from the mirrors themselves. Most disturbing of all was the largest mirror in Ashworth's collection. This ornate piece, framed in carved oak and standing nearly 6 feet tall, showed the village as it existed in that moment, but with one crucial difference. In the reflection, there were twice as many people as were actually present in the square. For every real villager, there was a reflected double, and these doubles were not passive mirror images. They were moving independently, interacting with each other, and most terrifyingly, they appeared to be planning something. The reflected doubles seemed to be organizing, forming groups and gesturing toward the edges of the mirror as if discussing how to break through. Some of the villagers recognized their own reflected selves among these doubles, but these weren't the benign reflections they had grown accustomed to fearing. These were aggressive, purposeful versions of themselves, and they appeared to be preparing for some kind of invasion. Ashworth, witnessing the villagers' terror and the impossible scenes playing out in his mirrors, tried to cover his wares. But it was too late. The damage had been done. The large mirror had shown the villagers something that changed everything they thought they knew about their situation. They weren't just dealing with strange reflections anymore. They were dealing with an entire reflected world, populated by doubles of themselves, and these doubles were actively trying to break through into the real world. The revelation sent the village into complete panic. People fled to their homes, barricading themselves inside and covering every reflective surface they could find. But the damage was already spreading. Those who had seen the mirrors in the square began reporting that their personal reflections had changed as well. No longer were they seeing passive doubles or strange warnings. Now they were seeing aggressive versions of themselves, reflections that pounded on the glass from the other side and mouthed threats that, while inaudible, were clearly hostile. Dr. Hartwell, maintaining his scientific approach despite his growing terror, began to document these new developments. His notes from this period reveal a man struggling to maintain his sanity while recording phenomena that defied every law of physics he had ever studied. He wrote, "The reflections are no longer content to simply observe or warn. They have become active participants in whatever is happening to our world. I fear we are witnessing the breakdown of the barrier between dimensions, and our reflected selves are preparing to cross over." The doctor's fears were confirmed when the first crossing occurred. Mary Ashford, the innkeeper's daughter, was found unconscious in her bedroom, lying in front of her covered mirror. When she regained consciousness, she spoke in a voice that was her own, but with an accent and manner of speaking that was subtly different. She claimed to be from a world where Greywater had been destroyed years earlier, where the villagers had failed to heed the warnings of their reflections. This other Mary insisted that she had crossed over to warn the real villagers of what was coming. According to her account, the reflected world was not a separate dimension, but a version of their own world that existed slightly ahead in time. The reflections they had been seeing were glimpses of their future selves, trying to send warnings back through time to prevent the catastrophe that had already occurred in their timeline. The catastrophe, according to this other Mary, was not a natural disaster or an invasion by outside forces. It was the complete breakdown of the barrier between the real world and the world of reflections. When that barrier failed, the two worlds would merge, creating a reality where nothing could be trusted, where every person existed in multiple versions simultaneously, and where the very concept of individual identity would cease to have meaning. The villagers who heard this account were faced with an impossible choice. They could dismiss other Mary as insane, the product of whatever force was affecting their reflections, Or they could accept that she was telling the truth, that their reflections had been trying to warn them all along, and that they were running out of time to prevent their world from collapsing into chaos. The debate that followed split the village into factions. Some, led by Dr. Hartwell, argued for a rational approach. They wanted to study the phenomenon, to understand it scientifically, and to find a way to restore the natural order of things. Others, influenced by Reverend Blackwood's increasingly apocalyptic worldview, believed that prayer and faith were their only hope against what they saw as a supernatural invasion. But a third group, led by Thomas Ashford and others who had been affected longest by the phenomenon, began to argue for a more radical approach. They believed that the only way to prevent the catastrophe was to destroy every reflective surface in the village, to eliminate the means by which the other world could observe and potentially cross into theirs. This faction began organizing nighttime raids, going from house to house and systematically destroying mirrors, polished metal objects, and even windows. They moved with the desperate efficiency of people who believed they were fighting for their very existence. But their actions only seemed to accelerate the breakdown they were trying to prevent. As February of 1848 dawned, Greywater had become a place of shadows and covered surfaces, where the simple act of seeing one's reflection had become a source of mortal terror. The village that had once been a peaceful farming community now resembled a war zone, with barricaded houses, broken glass littering the streets, and residents who moved through their daily lives with the haunted expressions of people who had seen too much. But the worst was yet to come. The destruction of the mirrors had not stopped the phenomenon. Instead, it had driven it underground, forcing it to manifest in ways that were even more terrifying than the original mirror incidents. The reflections, no longer confined to traditional reflective surfaces, began to appear in puddles in the eyes of animals and even in the polished surfaces of everyday objects like spoons and buttons. The village was running out of places to hide from its own reflection, and with each passing day the barrier between worlds grew thinner. The people of Greywater were about to discover that some problems cannot be solved by simply covering them up, and that running from one's reflection might be the most futile act of all. The final phase of Greywater's nightmare began with a sound that no one in the village would ever forget. It started as a low humming, almost like the drone of distant bees, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The sound grew stronger at night, vibrating through the walls of houses and seeming to resonate from within the very stones of the village itself. Dr. Hartwell was the first to identify the source. The humming was coming from the covered mirrors. Even though they had been shrouded in cloth, boarded up, or turned to face the walls, the mirrors were somehow still active. The doctor discovered this when he placed his ear against a covered mirror in his study and heard voices, dozens of them, speaking in urgent whispers from the other side. By March of 1848, the situation had deteriorated beyond all recognition. The other Mary's warnings proved prophetic as more crossings began to occur. Villagers would go to sleep as themselves and wake up as slightly different versions, with memories of events that had never happened in their world. These crossed-over individuals spoke of a Greywater where the harvest had failed 3 years running, where children had been born with strange abilities, where the very landscape had been altered by forces beyond human understanding. The most disturbing aspect was that these alternate selves were not trying to return to their own world. They seemed to be running from something even worse, something that had driven them to seek refuge in any reality that would accept them. When pressed about what they were fleeing, they would only whisper about the shattering, an event where all realities had begun to collapse into one another. Reverend Blackwood, his faith shaken to its core, made a desperate decision. He gathered the remaining villagers in the church and announced that they would perform an exorcism on the entire village. He had found references in ancient texts to similar phenomena, cases where communities had been invaded by what he called reflection demons. The ritual would require the participation of everyone in Greywater, and it would have to be performed at midnight on the spring equinox. But as the appointed night approached, it became clear that not everyone in the village was still themselves. Some of the crossed-over individuals had been replaced so seamlessly that their own families hadn't noticed the change. Others were obvious imposters, speaking with knowledge of events that had never occurred or referring to people who didn't exist in this reality. The final confrontation came when the villagers realized that their reflections weren't trying to invade their world at all. They were trying to escape from something that was pursuing them through the infinite maze of reflected realities. The true horror was not the reflections themselves, but what was hunting them, driving them from world to world in a desperate flight that had no end. On the night of the spring equinox, as Reverend Blackwood began his ritual, the mirrors throughout Greywater began to crack and splinter without being touched. The barriers between worlds weren't just failing, they were being deliberately destroyed by something that fed on the confusion and terror of merged realities. The last entry in Dr. Hartwell's journal, found years later by investigators, read simply, "We were never the ones being invaded. We were the ones being used as bait. God help whoever finds this record, for they too will become part of the hunt." When authorities finally reached Greywater in the spring of 1849, they found the village completely abandoned. Every mirror had been shattered from within, and the houses stood empty, their doors open as if the inhabitants had simply walked away in the middle of their daily routines. No bodies were ever found, no sign of struggle or violence. The people of Greywater had simply vanished, leaving behind only broken glass and the lingering echo of that strange humming sound. The village was never resettled. Even today, visitors to the ruins report feeling watched, and many claim to see figures moving in the fragments of broken mirrors that still litter the abandoned houses. Some say that on quiet nights you can still hear the humming, and that if you listen carefully you can make out voices whispering urgent warnings about something that's still coming, something that uses our reflections as windows into our world. The story of Greywater serves as a chilling reminder that sometimes the things we fear most are not trying to harm us but to warn us, and that sometimes the most terrifying realization is that we are not the hunters, but the hunted. This has been the Ghastly Journal. Remember to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our weekly descent into history's darkest corners. And the next time you glance into a mirror, remember the people of Greywater and ask yourself, is that really your reflection looking back at you, or is it something else entirely, something that's been waiting patiently for you to notice it? Until next time, stay vigilant. The truth is often more terrifying than any fiction, and sometimes the most ordinary objects hide the most extraordinary horrors.